All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we've got something to continue, which is the fiqh of marriage. And certainly with the fiqh of marriage, there's always a lot to say. But we try to stick to the subject, inshallah. And in the fiqh of marriage, we pretty much went over the fiqh of marriage in terms of the legal things in regards to engagement, in regards to marriage, in regards to that, the different relationship right there. We also did a whole series on how to make houses as homes. So we went into that and we talked about so many different things. That kind of took almost 6 classes right there, but it was really worth it. Now we're on the fiqh of divorce and we went into some details about making marriage resolutions and what that looks like. And we talked about talaq, we talked about the definition, we talked about the permissibility, we also talked about who can actually issue a divorce and what that looks like. And we talked about the numbers of divorce. We also went through the divorce issued by someone that is probably drunk or extremely angry in a coma, or perhaps some level of mental illness, whether we're speaking about an advanced mental illness case or let's call it a mild mental illness case. So we talked about that in details, in very deep details. And then we also talked about a person that is drunk and if they were to divorce, whether their divorce is valid or not. And of course, all of these are actually important to talk about. Just you probably might not think that these things exist within our community, but unfortunately, it really is prevalent a lot more than you think due to a number of different reasons, whether we're speaking about the close relations with non-Muslims or whether we're speaking about, of course, the society right now really exposed to a lot of fitness. So you could see that all of that is really going very deep within the Muslim community. So right now we're gonna talk about some more details in regards to, we talked about the condition divorce actually, but in regards to, we talked about the 3 divorces in one. We wanted to go in details with this one, which is الطلاق الرجعي and الطلاق البائن. Now, one thing let's see, I don't know if PowerPoint allows me to have like a view where I'm splitting. Let me see. I don't think it allows me to have a split type of a split type of a slide, kind of like like Microsoft Word does, but at least right there. So I'm just letting you know that I do have the slides that basically are translated. So I'll put those up on the website, inshallah. Remember, it's Aisha was AYSHAWAZWAZ.wordpress.com. So you will be having, if you go to, maybe I could show you right now so you could see it. Okay. And I'm going to show you that right now, right there. So I'm going to go AishaWasWas.wordpress.com. Here we go. And then you're going to go all the way with the categories to find it family fiqh. And then you're going to go with the family fiqh. You're going to go all the way right there. And let's see, fiqh of divorce. This is it. I'll update this one, even though I already have it, but I'll update it just to make sure that everybody has the updated version. Because the updated version basically has, these words that are not Arabic, they're basically translated right there. So in other words, for you to have access to them. Let's just go over talaq al-raj'i and talaq al-ba'in really quick because there are a number of different issues that must be discussed here. Number one, when we're talking about a revocable or an irrevocable divorce. So we broke that down and we said for talaq, so a talaq would happen, and then after the talaq would happen, so we would look into the case. The man has three, let's say, well, two, really technically, uh, two, let's call them strikes of divorce. And after the first strike, he would get like a time period, and that's the time, that's the waiting period, in order for him to be able to return the wife. And if he doesn't, then of course, if he wanted to go back to this marriage, then if the waiting period passes, then he would have to make a new marriage contract, and he would basically have to also wait for her consent. If she does not want to give consent, well, that's game over. Then he cannot bring her back unless she consents to going back to the marriage. And the same thing if we're talking about the second divorce, there would be a revocable time frame. And the first divorce and the second divorce are considered revocable. In other words, he can go back to the wife, but then it has to be within the waiting period. He can go back to the marriage, but it has to be within the waiting period. Now, that doesn't cancel out the divorce. It is still valid. It doesn't cancel out the divorce. It's still valid, but he would have the right to basically go back within the marriage, because this is basically, like we said, a first divorce is revocable, second divorce is revocable, and then let's look at this one. Once he does not bring her back in a revocable, in that time frame, basically during the waiting period, then that basically transitions the marriage from a revocable to an irrevocable unless he makes a new marriage contract. In the third divorce, it's considered an irrevocable divorce, and therefore they cannot go back unless she remarries, or unless she basically marries someone else without prior agreement. Okay, let's just go over some of those things that we said. So we said the different types of marriage, the divorce, sorry, is we said talaq ba'in, and that's basically the irrevocable kind. And the other one is basically the irrevocable one. So irrevocable and revocable. So the irrevocable one basically is what is called baynuna kubra. So that basically happens when a divorce happens before consummation. So let's say, like we said, they planned for a wedding, but they still didn't consummate the marriage. They weren't intimate yet. Okay. But right at when they were going into the car, he steps on her wedding dress. She gets angry. She says, I guess, some word that provokes him to say, you know what, you're taliq. That doesn't make it irrevocable. That doesn't make it revocable because it's the first one. It's actually irrevocable, and because there was no consummation. In other words, they weren't intimate. Okay. That's an irrevocable one because there was no consummation to that. Does she have to marry someone else if they decided, oh man, we shouldn't have done that? The answer is no. But she would, and he cannot go back on this just by saying, well, I regret doing this, etc. But the answer is not until she gives a new consent and a new marriage contract. So we're talking about a new marriage contract, but she was wearing the wedding dress and all of that. Well, we're talking about a new consent and a new marriage contract, and perhaps a new wedding too. Okay. So that would make it an irrevocable separation. And situation number 2 is basically a divorce that completes the first or second divorce. So we're talking about the divorce that completes the first or second divorce. What does that look like? So let's say the iddah finishes and he still didn't bring her back. What used to be an irrevocable divorce is right now, since the waiting period had happened, now this is irrevocable. Unless there would be a new marriage contract and a new consent if she approves it. And of course, the divorce in exchange for compensation, which is khula. So if the woman initiates that marriage resolution and a separation, and they both agree to exchange, let's say she says, you know what, I'm going to pay back your mahar. I'll give you back your mahar, and I would like to leave this marriage. Let's say she says that. I want to leave this marriage. I'm going to give you your mahar, and that's it. I'm leaving. Okay. Let's say he says, you know what, I don't consent to this. Okay. I don't consent to this. Then this isn't a valid khulu' yet. The khulu' would be valid if both sides agree. So she says, you know, here's your mahar, this is what you paid. And he said, okay, you know, that's fair. I'll take the mahar, and you want to end it, we'll just end it right there. Now, we'll talk about khulu' in details, but let's say he takes the mahar. She says, you know what? I'm going to Zelle this into your account. And here it is. He gets that into his account. And he basically right there, of course, gets that mahar that he had paid. And he says, all right, we're done. Then right after that, that actually does not mean there's no iddah. There is a iddah, but this is an irrevocable divorce. So therefore, he cannot return her unless they make a new marriage contract and she gives a consent. But during the waiting period, he can't say, you know what, I changed my mind. I'm going to return it to your account. I'm going to basically, you know, return it. I'm going to pay it back to you. And you know what? I don't think this is a good idea anymore. I'm not interested in accepting this anymore any longer. We'll say, no, you already did it. What's to your account? That's it. And you accepted already. So now you can go back. Even during the waiting period? Yes, even during the waiting period. So can she basically go back and say, you know what? I regret doing this. I think, you know, I want to go back into this relationship again. Does he have to make a new marriage contract and basically set everything the same way that we were talking about it before? The answer is yes, but just keeping in mind is that since she was the one that initiated the khulu', that doesn't mean she doesn't have a waiting period, but scholars actually had differences of opinions on how long the waiting period is. Is it one cycle? Is it 3 cycles? And of course, they all agreed that if she's pregnant until she gets her baby, but they had disagreements on whether it's 1 cycle of a waiting period or whether it's 3. So just to keep that one in mind. Okay. Now let's move on and talk about the other parts of the other parts of talaq al-ba'in right there. So number one, let's say, you know, we talked about that one. I'm just going to go over some of the notes right there. Okay. And we also talked about the part if they are alone. So even if they had a marriage contract, all right, but they still didn't do the wedding yet. Can they be alone? The answer is yes, but if they are alone and no intimacy happens, and let's say the divorce happens, does that actually fall as a revocable or an irrevocable divorce? Differences of opinions between scholars. Let's do this again. So they basically had a marriage contract. Father made it really clear, you guys cannot be alone. We don't want to get into trouble. We don't want any problems to happen, not until a wedding takes place. But somehow they basically stay alone. Did they get intimate? They didn't get intimate. And the girl says, we weren't intimate. The boy says the same thing. We were just talking about, I don't know, Pizza Hut and how their crust is very greasy, whatever. Okay. That's it. Now, since they were alone and then they got angry at each other, they disagreed whether Papa John's is better or whatever it is, and then they get angry for some weird reason, okay? And then he basically says, you know what, I'm ending this because you disrespected me, and there's no way that I can live with a person that disrespects me, okay? And then he basically says, "Inti talaq." Did they necessarily have any, you know, any type of a relationship? The answer is no, they didn't, but they were just alone in a room, in a closed room. No one was present. No third party was present. Okay. Now, in that situation, if he initiates the talaq, okay, does that talaq fall as irrevocable or revocable since they were together in a closed room? That's that differences of opinions between scholars. That's why I totally agree with the father when he said we don't want to get into trouble. Do not be alone. Just to stay on the safe side, wait till the wedding happens, and then inshallah you will basically be happily married forever, inshallah. So definitely just to stay away from all those different confusions and all those different let's say, going to the wrong ends. Make sure you just wait, don't rush, and definitely stay away from al-khalwa, and definitely do not get intimate before a wedding actually happens, just to stay on the safe side and keep everybody's rights in place. So for the Hanbali, let's just still get into some details. For the Hanbali, they regarded if there was a khalwa meaning that they were alone with no one there, okay, that would actually make it as a revocable divorce. But and that if we say revocable divorce, what does that mean? So if we say revocable divorce, that actually means, pay attention to this one, that actually means he can take the wife back. Look at this one, okay? If it is a revocable divorce, that means he can take the wife back and without her consent. She can say, you know what, I don't want to go back, etc. But guess what? According to the Hanbali, this happens to be a revocable divorce, meaning that he can take her back during the waiting period, and that we would count the very divorce 1, divorce 2, and basically go through that. It's just like a complete consummated marriage. For the majority of the scholars, they said no. If only khalwa happened and there was no intimacy, then there is no reason to call it as a revocable divorce, but it's an irrevocable one, and therefore he does not have the power to bring her back unless she would make a new consent and it would be a new marriage contract. You see the difference right there? If you were to call it a revocable and irrevocable, and just with that, and what the implications would be, we have to be really, really careful about that. So let's see the legal effect. If a divorce occurs before consummation or a valid seclusion, that's that valid seclusion, that khalwa thing, then it's an irrevocable divorce according to the majority, not the Hanbali. Okay? To the Hanbali, that no. To the Hanbali, it's a revocable one. And of course, if we're talking about an irrevocable divorce, then the husband has no right to take his wife back, except through a new marriage contract and new, basically, mahar. Okay? Now, we just did this one. If divorce occurs after valid seclusion, and that's that valid seclusion that we were talking about, which is when they're alone in a closed room, even though they weren't intimate, they could swear that they were not intimate, etc., but before a consummation. Okay, so the consummation, I would mean by that, meaning intimate. Okay, scholars had differences of opinions. The majority called it irrevocable divorce if they were to divorce. They said on the spot, no. It's an irrevocable divorce. The Hanbali, they're the ones that actually disagreed, and they said it's a revocable divorce right there. Okay, so let's look at the implication right there. For the revocable divorce, it's a type of divorce where the husband is permitted to take his wife back during her waiting period without a new marriage contract or mahar. And the return depends solely on the husband's will, and the wife's acceptance or refusal has no legal effect on the validity of the return. Keep that one in mind. What if she says, but I don't want to, I feel so disrespected, etc. We're gonna say, sorry, dear. He initiated this. What if she feels in danger? She says, he said he was gonna kill me. He's gonna beat me up. He's always beating me. He's not even giving me food, all of these different things. Let's just assume that. Okay. then in that situation, that would give her the right to say, well, I'm not feeling safe. That would give her the right to actually exit the relationship. But I must admit, there's a lot of exaggeration that women and many women like to play on this card and say, I don't feel safe. And a lot of times it basically is exaggerated. So I would like to say there has to be real religious integrity to really say and examine that there really was lack of security. And it's not some kind of an imaginated or a drama-based PTSD somehow, and that she's exaggerating that she doesn't feel safe. There has to be taqwa. There has to be taqwa. And I see this often that she will say, oh, he was really angry. He was yelling at me and I didn't feel safe, etc. And then they'll basically get into this, I would say, exaggerated mode of how insecure she was feeling and how insecure really the place is. So there needs to be taqwa. The ayah is really clear. Ladies, the ayah is very clear. لا تخرجوهن من بيوتهن ولا يخرجن. They should not leave their homes, and he should not get them out of their own home. What home we're talking about? We're talking about the home that basically contained this marriage. They should not leave. Why? Because this is in order to bring a possibility of a chance to bring about reconciliation. This is the key thing. إلا يأتين بفاحشة مبينة, unless there was, an evidence, a clear evidence of her cheating, and that's a different story, okay? But that's a completely different story and a very rare thing, I must admit. Alhamdulillah, our ummah is still in khair. Okay, now what if he did actually want to bring her back? We're going to go in details with that one, but of course, it would only be valid if you wanted to bring her back. It would only be valid during a waiting period. The waiting period ends, the husband may not take her back except through a new marriage contract. Okay, now let's go for this one, which is الطلاق الصريح and الطلاق الكنائي. So we're talking about a literal divorce and a figurative divorce. So what does that mean? We're talking about he pronounces something that is literally meaning, and if you ask anybody, it's only going to mean one thing, which is that this is literally saying you are divorced. You just made a clear statement that there's no way to misinterpret that or to change any or misunderstand it or bring about a different understanding whatsoever. It's clear, it's obvious. Then in that situation, that would be a literal divorce right there. The second type is a figurative one. So what does that mean? So that means the husband didn't say a word of talaq per se, but he uses a figurative term, metaphorical, figurative. It basically can mean multiple things. And then in that situation, the scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether we're going to be interpreting this figurative, whether we're going to be asking him about his intention and what his niyyah was really in to interpret what the let's say this very comprehensive statement or perhaps this very ambiguous statement, and what does that really mean? What did you really mean by that? So that's when the scholars actually had differences of opinions on should we use his intentions and basically let his intentions explain to us this anonymous or at least this very vague statement which we didn't understand, or we going to say, well, sorry, but this is a fake statement that doesn't actually act as a divorce. That's that huge debate. Don't want to get into that, but that's why I would say it's really important to sometimes go to the imam and get the real fatwa in order to explain basically this for you. Is this considered a valid divorce or not a valid divorce? And I want to explain another thing is that you might go to one imam and he might explain and basically take the opinion that this is a valid divorce using his statement when he said, for example, go back to your country, don't want you here, that's the end of our relationship, etc. Some scholars will say, well, is a figurative statement, or this is a vague statement that we're going to interpret that by making sure that we interview him in order to see what he really means by that. Second opinion of scholars, you will see scholars say, well, no, we don't need to interpret that. It's very clear. He said, go back to your country. I don't want this relationship anymore. You know what? You need to leave. That's it. It's the end between us. Some scholars will say, we've got three different statements and they only mean one thing. The third opinion basically says no, not unless the word anti taliq, not unless the word you are taliq, not unless the word that is to only mean talaq. That's the only time that we're going to take it as one clear statement to mean such. And therefore, all other statements to mean perhaps multiple interpretations were not going to necessarily take that. And then they had differences of opinions on which of these statements are going to be considered as a term that can act as a divorce or not, and so forth. So what if he uses like a conditioning on a future event? If you apply to this university, I don't want you going to this university for some reason, whether the reason was a valid reason, whether the reason was an exaggerated reason, or whether due to some paranoia that he's living in or whatever it is, but he conditioned it on something in the future. If you are to go to this university, then you are divorced. Let's say, for example, he said it in that clear term. If you go to this university, if you apply, then you're divorced. If you are to spend this money on something, let's say on I don't know, on a family reunion or whatever it is, then you're divorced. So does that actually happen? The majority of the scholars, they said, yes, it is valid. And therefore, it would basically be something just that second that it happened, that in that situation, it would basically be a valid divorce. And that's extremely dangerous to say. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given the men the power to learn how to control their words. So if he's not man enough to control his words and to watch his statements, then certainly his own marriage, his own relationship, his own everything that he basically had worked so hard to start and worked so hard to maintain could just fall into pieces right there. So make sure that when you get married, make sure that this man understands the power of his words and the weight of his words in order to basically approve to get into this relationship or not. Okay, let's see this one. There is something called talaq bid'i and talaq sunni. Let me explain this one. So the talaq bid'i, it sounds like a talaq that sounds like we're speaking about a bid'ah, like an innovation. Is that what it really means? And what is talaq sunni? Is this based on sunnah? And what do we mean by that? Okay, so generally speaking, scholars actually had two different opinions on the definition of talaq bid'i and talaq sunni. The first definition, they said, well, this basically means that this man is divorcing his wife in a relationship that is basically based on the timing. So she would have her period, okay? And of course, he basically is divorcing her in a relationship where, let's say she finished her period yesterday, okay? And then of course he divorces her, and of course, since she finished her period yesterday and he divorces her, now we're talking about she's going to be waiting, she's going to be basically waiting for 3 cycles in order to basically in order to basically end the iddah. Now, if let's say he was intimate, this is a talaq sunni. Up until there, this talaq sunni. What did he do? Was he intimate with her yet from the time she ended her period? No, he wasn't. That's a talaq sunni. In other words, now she can count normally those cycles, and her iddah would not be prolonged for a month. But let's assume that she had her period yesterday, finished. Then he was intimate with her, okay? Then was intimate, and then divorced her, got into some anger and divorced her, okay? Then, of course, since she had her period yesterday, then that means there's a high chance of basically her being pregnant, and then they're in that situation that's prolonging her waiting period. That's a talaq bid'i. Okay? That's a talaq bid'i. Now, the other interpretation is that a talaq sunni would be when she's not on her cycle. That's the second interpretation. A talaq sunni is to divorce the woman not on her cycle, not while she's having her period. Talaq bid'i then would mean that he's divorcing her while she's on her period. So why are you even talking about divorcing during a period, during her period, as basically bid'i? Why? Because a woman, while she's on her period, is going through different hormonal changes, and Islam takes that seriously. And just like a woman going through hormonal changes while she's on her period, Islam considers that there's a high chance of disagreement gone wrong while she was on her period. So those hormonal changes, whether mood swings and mood changes, and it's not just her, but it's also him, because he's also getting provoked by all of these mood things that she's going through, making it a talaq bid'i. So if he were to divorce her while she's on her period, that would be called a talaq bid'i, according to the second interpretation. Okay? According to the second interpretation. Now we have two interpretations. One interpretation is talaq bid'i and talaq sunni is to divorce the woman during the cycle or outside of cycle. So talaq sunni would be to divorce her when she's not on her cycle, and talaq bid'i would be to divorce her while she's menstruating. That's the first interpretation. The second interpretation is talaq sunni would be to divorce her in a time frame that he was not intimate with her after basically a cycle. If he were to be intimate with her after, let's say, a cycle had finished, and then he was intimate, and then he's divorcing her, that's the second interpretation. That you're just right there making that divorce, or sorry, that waiting period basically longer. Okay, so just putting in these differences of opinions between scholars to help us understand basically talaq sunni and talaq bid'i, and to help us get into some details, of course, just letting you know in situations where you're not sure what the ruling is on this or that matter, and therefore we would basically take the qadi that you're going through, and they're going to say their interpretation, they're going to basically make a final statement. Then in that situation, that qadi's final statement basically is bringing, let's say, a finalization to this dispute. You're not going to go to, oh, I'm going to go to another imam, maybe he'll tell me something else. Khalas, you went to one imam, he gave you one interpretation, that's it. You're not going to shop for an answer that basically satisfies you. So if that qadi that you were with, he finalized and he said, okay, this is a talaq sunni, therefore we're going to consider it as valid. Now here's one thing. The implication of talaq bid'i and talaq sunni. Also differences of opinions between scholars. Listen to this one. Is the talaq sunni or is the talaq bid'i, do they make that divorce valid or not valid? Is the divorce in itself valid? So let's say a talaq bid'i happens. Does that mean the divorce is not valid? Or does that mean that the person is at sin for making a talaq al-bid'i? Differences of opinions between scholars. Let me make the story short. And what does the implication look like? If we are to say, let's take the majority of the scholars that actually said that talaq sunni is to divorce the woman while she is not menstruating. This is the majority of the scholars. Okay, let's just take the majority. Let's just say he divorced her while she was on her period. Okay, then does that divorce fall as valid or not valid? Differences of opinions between scholars. The first opinion, yes, it is valid. The second opinion, it is not valid. The third opinion, it is valid, but it is makruh, but it is hated, and what he had done was a sin. Okay, three differences of opinions, not two, but three. First one is valid, and therefore, yes, it's bid'ah, it's a talaq bid'i. That's not what the Prophet ﷺ told you to do. You divorced a woman during her cycle. That's not acceptable. So the first one is but it is still valid. You're held accountable for doing that, but the divorce is still valid. The second opinion, there's a reason why it's called talaq bid'i. That's the second opinion. They said if it's talaq bid'i, then therefore it should not be as a valid divorce. And therefore, since he divorced her while she was on her period, we already have a name. It's talaq bid'i to actually mean that this is not what Islam's instruction basically is, and therefore it's not valid. The third opinion basically said, actually, it is valid and he's held accountable. So that's pretty much like the first opinion that said it was valid, but then they added that makruh piece of it. So I would say the third opinion really is similar to the first opinion, but they kind of gave it a different interpretation. Okay, gave it a different interpretation. And I would say, sometimes, when you go to the books of fiqh, sometimes they'll disagree, not necessarily on the implication always, but sometimes on what is the proper wording for it. What is the proper wording for it? How do we understand this? And how do we word it in a statement that makes it basically the most appropriate description for the situation? Okay, so just to keep that one in mind. Now, of course, when we're speaking about a divorce happening, it's important to mention it. Do we necessarily have to register the divorce or the talaq? The answer is it doesn't have to be registered in order for it to be valid. If a divorce happens, then in that situation, ladies, if you know a divorce happened, insist that, I'm sorry, but not before we basically get a fatwa in regards to this, am I going to accept to basically be in this relationship, or at least know what the fatwa is in regards to this, just to know whether our marriage is valid or not. So get the fatwa, not his fatwa. And what if he says, no, I will not allow you to talk to any sheikh or shaykha to get the fatwa in regard to this, and you're not allowed to, he does not have the right to prevent you from seeking a fatwa. He doesn't have the right. What if he himself is a sheikh? What if he himself is a sheikh? Then in that situation, seek, and just because he is a sheikh, he can be held accountable and he can say, well, I'll give you the fatwa. Well, I don't know if there's a conflict of interest right there. You giving the fatwa that basically suits your own preferred circumstance, then in that situation, she can say, well, I need to seek another fatwa. Thank you, sir. She does have the right. What if he refuses? He doesn't have the right to refuse. He doesn't. That's outside of his jurisdiction. And I've had this very often that husbands would say, you cannot ask and you cannot call, not a sheikh, not a sheikhain, etc. Sorry, that's outside of your jurisdiction. That's outside of your jurisdiction and therefore does not have the right to do that. All right. So now as for registering the divorce, it's important to say for registering the divorce, do we have to register it? It doesn't have to be registered, but it's good to register it just to keep to keep those counts basically in place. That's number one. Number two, how do we register it? Sorry about that. So for registering the divorce and the talaq, you can go to a masjid. You can basically make sure that this is a valid or not a valid divorce and basically get that fatwa from a scholar in order to make sure you're doing the proper things right there. Okay, now for the iddah. For the iddah, of course, in regards to the iddah, of course, it's basically the waiting period a woman must observe after the end of a marriage, whether we're speaking about a divorce or we're speaking about the death of the husband. Okay, now, a number of different things to say. Of course, Islam is really clear about that the Prophet ﷺ had said, ملعون من سقى ماءه زرع غيره. A man that irrigates somebody else's water is mal'un. Islam is extremely strict on making sure that the paternity for the children is basically clear to the child, to the people, and basically to the father himself. So in situations where a zina might happen, or for example, a divorce might happen, Islam is extremely strict in regards to defining iddah, when it begins, how it ends, and all those details, because Islam is strict in considering the children's rights, paternity rights, the father's rights, the mother's rights. All of that is extremely important. And that's why Islam is extremely strict with the definition of iddah, extremely strict on saying, no, we need a waiting period to ensure that there's no pregnancy. What if we are to do a pregnancy test? That's not enough to do a pregnancy test and say, well, we're done. No, there are certain protocols, there are certain strict rules to ensure with 100% certainty that there is no pregnancy. What if they were to do an ultrasound? All of these different things, they are not 100% sure. And plus, iddah is not only to ensure no pregnancy is at stake, but is also to sometimes give further time for whether we're speaking about mental stability or whether we're speaking about psychological mental, or whether we're speaking about a chance during a revocable divorce, at least a chance to bring about this marriage to go basically go back in flow, in perhaps maybe once people are feeling better, that there's a higher chance, a high probability that this may actually bring about a chance of getting this marriage to working out again. Okay, but of course, iddah is in the Quran. Iddah is in the Quran, so there is no question about it. But just keep it in mind, it's not just to preserve the lineage and to preserve the pregnancy and a paternity and all of that, but it's also an opportunity for reconciliation. It's basically also respecting the marital bond. You can't just end this relationship by saying, okay, that's it, I'm walking out, and just walk out. And I see this very often, that a girl would get married. I discovered that we don't click, and just basically walks out. No, 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 dear, things don't happen like that. I'm not sure I want this anymore, and basically walks out. Absolutely not. This isn't a game. You cannot just leave like that. And he cannot leave either. You both are going to be in this household, and during that iddah, both of you, both of you have to be there, because this is to help you basically grow in making this relationship work out. Unless this is an irrevocable and third divorce, that's a different story. But of course, respecting the marital bond, and especially whether we're speaking about in a case of death, for example, acknowledge the seriousness of this relationship and so forth. But there was an interesting study. I don't want to go into it because I don't know, in how scientifically how true that is or not, that in a state of a trauma, that a woman's hormones and even, all of that, basically in a state of trauma, changing everything. So if in a state of a husband's death, for example, the trauma basically changing even how her cycle and how her body basically reacts to the trauma, and how her body reacts even to perhaps even uh uh the fertility and all of that, it changes. Allahu A'lam, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but it was quite interesting when I was actually listening to it. So tell me more about that if you basically have information about that. Emotional and social protection. It basically, of course, recognizes the psychological impact, and basically on the separation and loss, and especially women, of course, the way we relate to the relationship, whether in the beginning of a relationship or the end of a relationship, the way we relate to it is completely different than men. Completely different, because we're social beings, we're very emotional. Whether a new person enters our life, or whether a person ends or basically exits our life, we basically react to it completely, in a completely different way than how the men would move on. How they relate to it is completely different. In our psychology as women, a new person entering our life, or a new person, or a person exiting our life, it basically either creates a huge vacuum, or can create a new dynamic in our life, in our psychology, in our relationship, in our emotions, in our hormones. Everything is related to our social dynamic, and it's a completely different thing. Let alone, of course, if we're talking about a husband all of a sudden missing in her life, or perhaps a husband entering, or a man entering her life, her emotions, everything basically just goes completely different in compared to the way that how it was before. And of course, we did talk about the types and the durations of iddah, and we said that for a woman who menstruates, she basically is to wait 3 cycles, and that's based on the ayah. Divorced women shall wait 3 periods, so that's basically in Surah Al-Talaq. Or what is the ayah? What is the ayah? I forgot the ayah right now. It's not. What is the ayah? Just went right out the window. Okay, women who do not menstruate. واللائي لم يحضن وأولات الأحمال. Those are the women that are pregnant. واللائي لم يحضن وأولات الأحمال. And for واللائي يئسن من المحيض فعدتهن 3 أشهر. That's basically the women who do not menstruate. And of course, the divorce before consummation. That's actually differences of opinions between scholars and the details. If we're talking about a divorce before consummation, what do you mean before consummation? We're talking about before basically intimacy. Just like the man basically stepped on his wife's wedding dress, okay? And she got angry, basically said a very bad word, and he responded, you're taliq. If you can say that bad word right now, well, who knows what you're going to do in the future, but never you trespass your boundary in my honor, according to him. And of course, basically divorced her right on the spot. Then in that situation, is there a idda? Then we'll go in details. Was there a valid time when they were alone together? Was there any foreplay whatsoever? Were they intimate at all? And of course, we're talking about after a marriage contract. So in that situation, we're seeing divorce before consummation. We're talking about an actual intimacy happening. If there is no intimacy, then there is no iddah. And that's why the ayah was really clear about it, that if they were not intimate, that then there's no iddah. But here's one thing. Like I said, if there is a valid isolation, they were together in a closed room, and of course, we're talking about a valid marriage contract, okay? We're not talking about, a girl and a boy sitting together. I don't know what they were doing in a closed room, because that's absolutely haram. There's no question that a boy and a girl cannot be together alone, whether they were sitting on a beach or whether, I don't know, walking together on a trail or whatever, a boy and a girl together. That's basically absolutely haram. There's no question about it. But if we're talking about they had a marriage contract, okay, and they're walking along the beach, okay, they had a valid marriage contract. Okay, then in that situation, what is the ruling if they were alone and not in a closed room? There's no iddah. But if they were alone in a closed room, but they weren't intimate, no foreplay either, then questions rise whether there is a iddah or not. Remember the Hanbali, they regarded there is a iddah. Okay, so wanted to note that one. What about the iddah after the husband's death? Basically 4 months and 10 days. The ayah is really clear in regards to that. In regards to when the iddah after a husband's death, basically, and of course 4 months and 10 days. We're speaking about 4 months and 10 days in regards to lunar months, and not speaking about basically Gregorian calendar. And of course, if the wife is pregnant, then her iddah ends after childbirth. What does iddah mean? Okay, that's the question. How does she perform the iddah? Only leaves the house for necessary reasons. Whether we're speaking about due to the husband's death or whether we're speaking about a divorce. Only leaves the household for necessary reasons. Does that mean that she does not go to work? No, that's a necessary reason if she has to go to work. What if she needed to get groceries? Well, that's unnecessary reasons to get groceries. Or to go to clinic. She needed to see a doctor's appointment. Well, she can go to a doctor's appointment. But what if she wanted to walk to the park? What if her friend invited her to her wedding? That's not a necessary reason. But it's her best friend, not a necessary reason. But she feels so sad about her husband, and this is going to help her basically heal. Sorry, dear, heal differently. Heal differently. That's the whole thing. The Quran is basically giving you this iddah as a way to heal anyways. How is that? How am I by being socially isolated? I'm not telling you to socially isolate yourself. Your friends can come over. That's okay. Your friends, they can come over. They can make you feel good. You don't have to close the windows. No, it's okay. You can see sunshine. You can see sunshine. But for the death of the husband, there's actually an extra, there's an extra thing that she's supposed to perform during the iddah of the death of the husband, which is called the hidad. What is it, hidad? Hidad is basically she abandons every single type of what is considered as cosmetics. So whether we're speaking about cosmetics such as, I don't know, makeup, any type of cosmetic, is this called cosmetics? Yes, it's called cosmetics. Then do not apply it. What if, I get this question frequently from sisters of color. They would say, well, can I use oils on my hair? If I don't use oils on my hair, then that's going to affect basically me combing my hair. Oils on the hair is not necessarily cosmetics. Okay, this could be really just an issue of just to help you comb the hair, especially for the sisters of color. Okay, but we're talking about anything that is considered an adornment that would be considered as basically whether we're speaking about maybe dressing up. Does she have to dress up in black? No, she doesn't have to dress up in black, but clothes that are considered of adornment, prom dresses and all of that. And then in that situation, that would actually be considered as not hidad. That would not be permissible for a woman that is mourning basically the death of her husband. Okay, so she would have to do hidad. What about a woman that is in a iddah, that is in a during divorce? Does she have to do that? No, absolutely not. Well, what does she do? What is the difference? The difference is that during the death of the husband, she would be mourning by not applying anything that is related to cosmetics. But a woman that is during basically iddah, during a divorce, she still does not go out the house unless there's a reason, necessary reason, just like the death of the husband mourning. Okay, but she does not have to abstain from any cosmetic stuff. Okay, of course, she would basically not do it in front of non-mahram anyways, or sorry, in front of in front of it's okay to do it in front of the husband, but certainly not in front of non-mahrams. Or of course, we already know about hijab, so no need to discuss that one. But just wanted to mention the mourning piece of it, as this is mandatory to basically mourn after the death of the husband and not leave the household unless there is a necessity. Yes, even if we're speaking about a woman during during the iddah due to divorce, does not leave the household unless there is a necessity, doctor's appointment, etc. But hey, the husband divorced his wife and she wants to go, and he's angry. He's not even talking to her, but she wants to go to her friend's wedding. It only happens once in a lifetime. Sorry, dear, you're supposed to be right now during iddah. Do not leave your household unless there's a necessity. And certainly, if this is a revocable divorce, then your husband still has the power and still has the authority to basically tell you, and that you cannot leave the household unless with the husband's permission. What if he gave her the permission to go to her friend's wedding? Okay? But he still is not bringing her back. Can she go to her friend's wedding? The answer is yes, she can go to her friend's wedding if he had given her the permission. Okay. But certainly we're speaking about لا يخرجن differences of opinions between scholars whether him giving her the permission to leave, because the ayah says وَلَا يَخْرُجْنَ, that they should not leave unless there was a necessary reason, whether that makes it permissible or not for her to go to her friend's wedding. The first opinion said yes, she can, since her husband gave her the permission. Second opinion says no, she cannot, because the ayah says وَلَا يَخْرُجْنَ, and they could only go for necessary reasons. Okay, now I'm just, laying it out there. The legal effects during iddah. In a revocable divorce, the marriage bond still exists. Husband has the authority to say you cannot leave or you can leave. This is a marriage bond. It still is there. Husband may take his wife without a new contract, even if she refuses, but he can say, well, you know what? I'm the one that initiated the divorce. But she says, I'm still angry. Don't want it this way. Well, you're still probably angry. He'll have to do his homework in making her feel better, but the marriage bond is still valid. Wife remains entitled to maintenance and housing. In other words, she is still entitled to basically getting the coverage for basically all the housing and all of the different things that she was getting during the relationship basically still being valid. It's still valid. In an irrevocable divorce, no return is allowed unless, of course, a new marriage contract happens, unless we're talking about a third divorce. The marriage bond is severed. Well, same rights like housing may remain depending on the circumstance. If we're talking about an irrevocable divorce, so the scholars actually had differences of opinions in regards to a third divorce, whether during the waiting period, whether she still has the right to, even though she's not living with him in a third divorce, whether she still has the right to get housing maintenance. Majority of the scholars said no, she doesn't have the right for housing maintenance in a third divorce. But she still has to practice iddah, but not get nafaqah and not get basically the housing. And what I mean by housing, I don't mean just rent, but I mean things like utility bills or food and etc. So basically talking about all of those different things. Some scholars actually said, yes, she does get that because she's in a iddah, and that iddah, yes, the marriage ended, but this iddah and basically this maintenance, she gets it to help her transition. We can't just leave her like that, basically homeless, if let's say she doesn't have any family. So therefore, he would have to maintain her, according to the second opinion, give her that maintenance at least for the time that she is in her waiting period. There's no question, if she is pregnant, that she would get maintenance for child support, even though the child is not born. Child support, even though the child is not even born. Yes, she would get maintenance while she is pregnant. All right, to a certain number, then the scholars will go into certain details, but she would get, and she would have the right to maintenance because she is pregnant. And of course, this is a baby right there, unborn, but Islam went way beyond even the different courts and considered that, yeah, she's babying, she's a mother to your baby, and she is basically pregnant, and in other words, maternity right there. And since she is going through all of this, and certainly that's that waiting period that we need you to cover the expenses while she is basically being a mother to your child, at least during pregnancy. After pregnancy, does she have the right for for taking care of the children and baby. Well, if we're talking about child support, we'll be talking about that inshallah. Conduct during iddah. No marriage contract may be concluded. So what does that mean? We're talking about if during the iddah, in other words, she cannot get married to anybody during iddah. And in fact, no one can even propose to this woman. Not even especially if we're talking about a revocable divorce. A revocable divorce during the first and second divorce, remember, revocable divorce, she is still considered as married. But I thought there was a divorce. Yes, but the iddah didn't finish. She was still considered married. No one can come and ask for her hand and propose whatsoever. Okay. Now, in the case of a widow, no formal engagement can be done, but there can be a non-formal and let's say a figurative statement done. Something like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you something better. Don't worry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're a woman that is, mashallah, very good in reputation and a very religious woman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you a better person. Even though, wait a minute, did he actually make a clear, in a direct statement that he was proposing to this woman? No. It was not a clear statement, but he was giving this kind of I guess a referral, a hidden statement that he was interested in her. That's permissible for a widow only. So what about if we are to talk about, if we're talking about a situation where an irrevocable divorce happened, or sorry, so we're talking about a divorce, and right now it got to the limit of irrevocable, then in that situation, of course, in the first and second divorces, so this woman, let's give an example. This woman gets divorced, the iddah passes, now this becomes irrevocable. And can people now propose to her? But this is the first or second divorce. Yes, people can propose to her after the waiting period had done. After the waiting period had basically finished, then in that situation, people can propose to her since the waiting period finished and her husband didn't bring her back. Okay, but can men propose to women if they are during the waiting period in a third divorce? The third divorce, she's in her waiting period. Can men propose to her during that waiting period? Majority of the scholars said no. But anyways, she can't go back to her husband. They said, let the waiting period pass. Don't rush. Other scholars, they said, well, since this is a third waiting period and there's no going back, then they went into details of giving some, just like the widow, of giving, somewhat of an informal type of a statement. Anyway, she could never go back to her husband. They said, well, wait a minute, but we need to wait. That's the majority. The other scholars, they said, well, anyways, she can't go back to her husband. So she cannot formalize an engagement, but can people come forward to ask for her hand in marriage? That's that area of debate as well. Okay, let's see, right there. I'm going to stop right there because I know that it's basically It's basically late for most of you. So we'll stop right there. A couple things to talk about, inshallah. We're actually really close to ending, at least hopefully tomorrow we'll be continuing this, and hopefully we will continue later on. We still have child custody, and we still have a couple divorce things to talk about. Divorce things to talk about, not just child custody, maintenance, we nafaqah right there. We still have, let's see, topics like ila and dhihar. We'll cover those as well. So very few topics, inshallah, but inshallah we'll stay committed to finishing everything in regards to fiqh of marriage. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. So any questions before we end, my friends? I guess not.